Hello, welcome to Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. I'm your host for this episode, Ted Gotch, and today we will be speaking to Katie Dzurec, the Academy's Director of Public Policy State Outreach, and Ethan Sonnichsen, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners' Chief Government Affairs Officer, about the relationship between the two organizations and how they work together to improve public policy. Katie and Ethan have a well-rounded perspective on this, given their past employment histories. If this was football, I might say they've had experience on both sides of the ball. But, it's not. So maybe we'll just start by having them tell us about their backgrounds, beginning with Katie.
Sure. Thanks, Ted. So my journey to the Academy was along the public service road. I was a legislative aide for the Maine House for a few years before joining the leadership team at the Maine Bureau of Insurance, where I was swept up in the magic of the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2009 and 2010. I spent a few years at the Georgetown Center on Health Insurance Reforms. I helped stand up a health insurance co-op. I worked for the Obama administration doing ACA enforcement and spent some time in the regulatory consulting space. And then I put a few years in at the Pennsylvania Insurance Department working on rates and forms, market conduct, policy, that sort of other duties as assigned when you're a special assistant to the commissioner. But throughout that journey, I always found myself engaging with the NAIC in one way or another. When I was a regulator, I got to be on work groups. On the consulting side, I'd listen in on the work groups and just be part of everything and, share my thoughts as an interested party whenever it was helpful. But regardless of the role I was playing, I always brought something back from the conversations that were happening at the NAIC. Insights from other regulators, issues that overlap with mine. There's just so much to partner on, and I'm always so grateful for that because my interactions with the NAIC throughout my career have really shaped who I am today as a professional.
And Ethan, can you just share with the audience your background as well?
Sure. Yeah. And thanks, Ted, for inviting me onto the podcast. So my journey, not as many stops, I think, as Katie's, but came to DC to the area to finish up school at University of Maryland, go Terps, and just sort of stayed in the area and realized that what I had been studying, I wasn't really interested in, which was more sort of technology, and ended up working in a government affairs office for a big media company called Viacom. And that kind of gave me a little bit of exposure to public policy and sort of working with folks on the Hill and, building campaigns around issues and things like that. And I became a legislative assistant there and sort of ran the PAC and did things like that. But the issues didn't really interest me. It was very kind of corporate and intellectual property, and it wasn't really that stimulating. A friend of a friend introduced me to a guy by the name of Todd Tootin, who had just become the director of public policy. He'd come off the Hill. He's now the director of public policy at the Academy. And I'm going to be honest, I barely knew what an actuary was. I think I was like, okay, it has something to do with insurance. I remember my high school guidance counselor telling me that if you become an actuary, you'll always have a job, and it's a good one at that. And I was decent at math, but not decent enough to actually be an actuary. And that was my knowledge. But Todd was a very charismatic guy and told me about sort of the impact of actuaries on insurance and insurance on society and made a really compelling pitch. And so I kind of came over to the actuaries. I was, staff support for a new council that was being formed, the Risk Management Financial Reporting Council, which didn't really exist up till that point. Got to work with some really amazing actuaries like Bert Jay and Pat Tuffle, Ralph Blanchard, Rowan Bell, and a bunch of others, Bill Hines, plenty of names I can't even really remember at this point, but just some really amazing and inspiring people. And what struck me about them was, they all obviously work for different companies and they have their corporate interests, but when they come to the Academy, they sort of take that hat off and put on their professionalism hat and focus on, how can we best support the development of public policy. And so at working for several years at the Academy, I got to see that happening, certainly with, congressional offices and things like that, and even a little bit on the international stage. But really, it felt like our main focus was sort of where regulation was being built, and that was at the state level, and specifically through the NAIC. So that was my exposure to this crazy three-ring circus known as the NAIC, and just built a lot of relationships with the staff and regulators through that exposure, and just became fascinated. And what struck me was at the time that I was paying attention to politics and what was going on in Washington, and we were already seeing some signs of sort of dysfunction. And I was very kind of, I wouldn't say disillusioned, but disheartened by the politics of the moment. And I realized I was much more interested in policy than politics. And I really saw that playing out at the NAIC level in a way that was compelling. I saw, Republicans and Democrats working together to kind of solve challenges, and that really appealed to me. So I kind of resolved to, when I had an opportunity, to try to find a spot for myself at NAIC. In 2006, that happened. I jumped over to the DC office of NAIC, and we started to work on the response to Hurricane Katrina. And then right around 2007, early 2008, the first sort of signs of a growing financial crisis reared their head. And so I was at the NAIC during the beginnings of that and the bond insurance crisis and ultimately the global financial crisis. I think we testified something like 27 times in the span of about a year at that point. I mean, we were just constantly on the Hill. And so I probably got about 5 years of worth of work and experience in about 18 months. But a former regulator, Terry Vaughn of Iowa, who had been an NAIC president, came over to the NAIC and was our CEO. And she and I got along really, really well. I think I told her all the time, I used to work for the actuaries, and that got me some street cred with her. And she promoted me, and eventually I became the director of that office and took on international affairs. And that role has evolved now over the last 19 years I've been at the NAIC. So it's all of the federal and international affairs, the communications division, supporting a staff that supports several of the committees, the Life and Health Committee, as well as the International Committee, kind of report up through me now. So it's been a really just amazing journey. I never envisioned my career kind of going down this path. I don't think anybody chooses insurance, and maybe unless you're an actuary, you just sort of fall into it. But it's been absolutely fascinating and incredibly rewarding.
Given both your backgrounds there, if you could just describe the working relationship between the Academy and the NAIC.
Sure. I think there are really two tracks that we're on from the Academy perspective with the NAIC. First, we have a long-standing relationship with the actuarial task forces, with the risk-based capital groups under E-Committee. Those groups where actuaries play a role in developing or testing models, for example. I mean, essentially, like Ethan said, NAIC staff and regulators, like when you talk about being an actuary and working with the actuaries, you gain a lot of street cred. They know that they can reach out to the Academy, and they do, right? Our committees work closely with LATIF, HATIF, CASTIF on all kinds of projects. We regularly submit comment letters on exposures. I mean, the Life Practice Council webpage is really just a laundry list of comments and presentations to the NAIC. And I think working with the Academy is actually mentioned in at least one of the task force's charges. So there's that built-in, actuarial support that the Academy is part of with the NAIC. I think the second track, which the Academy has always done, but we're starting to focus on it more and build it up, is Academy contributions to the policy initiative conversations across all the groups, all the letter committees. I mean, we at the Academy put out hundreds of resources every year. And so we're sort of looking to share more of those resources in a meaningful and helpful way for the regulators. And again, we've been doing that. It's a two-way street, sharing information. But I think one of our volunteers said it best recently: how do we learn more? And how can we help? And so I think part of helping and offering more is to make sure that we identify the avenues to share those resources in a better way, connect the dots, make our extensive library of resources more accessible to an expanded audience. And so thinking about how the work of our Health Practice Council ties to what B committee subgroups are doing. What's regulatory framework working on? What's the MAPIA working group working on? We've got committees in the Health Practice Council who have some really relevant topics to share and really relevant resources to share. Thinking about making connections between the Academy's International Committee and G committee members. So I think there are just so many opportunities for more conversations across the board, and we are really working on building those out.
Ethan, what are your thoughts in this area?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important relationship. Actuaries bring a skill set that, frankly, is in short supply among state insurance departments and even at the NAIC with its resources. And so to be able to tap into a resource that brings together actuaries from different practice areas with different levels of expertise and kind of put it all, together through a process and, having sat in those rooms and understanding and watching how the actuaries work and how they do, in fact, kind of take their own sort of corporate self-interests out of it as much as they can. To me, that gives it a certain credibility that I think it would be hard for me to point to another trade association or industry group or consumer group even that would have the same kind of unique role and credibility as the Academy. And I think, Not that you need my advice, but I would encourage you to preserve that as much as possible. Preserve that sort of nonpartisan, this is what makes sense from a professional perspective. That's hugely important because we can rely on that. And it feels like half of what we're doing at any given moment ties back to solvency and risk management. And that's something that actuaries are uniquely positioned to help educate regulators, inform what we're doing. And I also like what Katie said about don't just limit yourself to kind of talking to your clique at the actuarial task forces. I think there's a lot of work going on, and some of it's broader than what you might immediately think of where an actuary might have a point of view. But we would benefit significantly from your insight, from your expertise, what you're seeing. A number of actuaries are working with firms that are consultant firms, so they're dealing with multiple clients around the world, so they have a unique perspective that they can bring to our work that you just can't really replicate anywhere else. So I personally think it's, even though I don't staff those task forces, I think it's invaluable. So I would encourage the continued engagement.
Well, thank you for that. And that certainly sort of leads into our next question. If you can expound it all on it, and again, we start with Katie, as far as what value does the Academy bring to the NAIC?
I think the short answer is we provide an actuarial perspective in the regulatory discussions at the NAIC. As Ethan mentioned, there aren't a whole lot of actuaries serving in states and at the NAIC, so it helps to have that actuarial perspective come in from an objective source, an external source, and be available to be part of those discussions. I think the longer answer is, the Academy's mission is to serve the public in the U.S. actuarial profession, and that centers around being able to provide objective actuarial advice to all policymakers at any level, in any office, to all decision makers. And our volunteers are constantly creating timely and relevant issue briefs, putting out papers, hosting webinars, and for the NAIC, engaging in the process. So attending the meeting, commenting on exposure drafts. We bring the actuarial expertise to the table. And just a few examples, this year, we have had Academy staff and volunteers at all of the national meetings. We monitor and participate on a number of the interim conference calls. We've engaged in numerous cross-practice efforts. I think the two biggest really are the Big Data and AI Working Group and then the Risk-Based Capital Model Governance Task Force. We've had all of our practice councils or most of our practice councils engaging in those conversations and submitting comments. The Health Practice Council also presented on health insurance premium drivers to the Health Actuarial Task Force, and then engaged with the Senior Issues Task Force on the state of long-term care market. So you're not just seeing the Academy in the actuarially focused groups. We're paying attention to, and we're engaging in, and we're bringing resources to the policy discussions just across the board.
And Ethan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, beyond, I think, what we've covered quite a bit. Certainly the credibility, the perspective, the unique voice and role, the nonpartisan take on issues. I think that's all critical. I guess I would point to, just as the Academy is powered by volunteers who have been given, the freedom from their employers in many cases to kind of dedicate not an insignificant amount of time. I remember bothering the chair of my practice council all the time when we were building out a monograph or something like that, and the amount of energy that they could put into it, I always found very impressive. But the NAIC is the same way. State insurance regulators have a very, very much full-time day job. NAIC is effectively volunteer work that they have to do on the side. They have to make that same commitment to collaboration and trying to sort of iron out any inconsistencies and learning from each other. But it's all sort of secondary to their main mission. And so they don't have unlimited resources to do that. And one of the things that's nice about the Academy is the Academy seems to have a little bit more bandwidth to dedicate enough attention span to complex issues and kind of take your time, dig into them. There's not 100 committees and task forces and subgroups meeting where commissioners and regulators' attention is spread. They can only dedicate a certain amount of time. I know probably from the outside, it feels like things move very slowly at the NAIC, but I can tell you from the inside, it feels very frantic. It feels like we're always going a million miles an hour. So we don't have time to step back and do thoughtful research and analyze the data in every instance. And so having a resource like the Academy that can take that time and do it well, do it credibly, take the time to kind of give us informed information and insights is just it's like a tool to have in your toolbox that we can't utilize enough.
I think that when people think about policy, they somehow connect that to politics, even though that might not really be accurate. So I'm just curious how, the NAIC and the Academy navigate those issues.
Yeah, I mean, NAIC at the end of the day is a nonpartisan organization, but obviously every commissioner is a creature of their state, right? They're appointed by a governor with a political perspective, or they're elected by people and have a political perspective. And so those things don't go away. They don't magically go away when you come inside the NAIC. But, what I have seen happen, and I've been doing this now for 19 years, and I find it incredibly, frankly, inspiring to see Republican and Democrat commissioners get together to tackle issues and find common ground. And, honestly, Congress could learn a thing or two from that process, because we try to take the politics out of it. Politics is just a means to an end. And when some of our models or things go back to the states, they may be subjected to a slightly different political perspective in each state. We're very much aware of that, but we try to keep that out of the process of building what we just think is good public policy. And the result of that is you tend to get answers that are not sort of at the fringes of ideology, but sort of somewhere in the middle, right? They balance those perspectives. Things like climate risk. We can still say those words at the NAIC. It's harder to say that in Washington at the moment. So you also don't see the swings back and forth. You don't see the giant swings in sort of ideology at the NAIC that you might expect to see maybe in Washington when you have changes in power. You expect that in DC. You shouldn't expect that in insurance regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I think actual actuarial science is nonpartisan. It's subjective, right? I mean, actuaries are humans, but our goal is to provide independent analyses to support informed decision making. That's not political. That's just good practice. I think one thing that's cool to watch, especially having gotten my start in the legislative space, is that when our committees are meeting, when they're working on a project, when they're doing their research, when they're having conversations about even how to say something, they're thinking about it in a way that is balanced and objective. They're thinking about, like, okay, is the word we're using a loaded term and for some, and should we adjust around that? And so, I mean, I think the bottom line is we strive in the work that we do and the way we do it to remain objective, to remain nonpartisan, and just make sure that the information we're putting out supports informed decision making. Whatever someone wants to do with that once they get the information, totally up to them. But the information they're getting from us doesn't have a slant one way or the other.
Right, absolutely. Let me take a moment to remind listeners that you are listening to Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. On this podcast, we talk to Academy volunteers and leaders, as well as friends of the Academy, about their work, both professionally or as a friend of or volunteer with the Academy. Please subscribe to Actuary Voices on your preferred podcast platform. And now, back to our conversation with Katie and Ethan about the relationship between the Academy and the NAIC. Ethan, I know you sort of brought up about the sort of partisan nature of the nation's capital. So, I mean, that sort of does lend itself. What does it look like then when NAIC engages with political audiences like Congress, for example?
Yeah, it's changed a bit in my time with NAIC. I mean, it's kind of grown more partisan. I mean, and regardless of which party's in power, I would say, too. We've just seen a little bit of that, where we used to be able to do, briefings that were more on a bipartisan basis, and you'd get the staff from both parties kind of coming. And now you do have to sort of do it one at a time, so to speak. There's a little bit less of that sort of nonpartisan approach coming out of like the committees and things. So you just have to factor that in. But, we have to spend a fair amount of time in front of Congress, because insurance is an $8 or $9 trillion industry that touches every part of our society and business. And so Congress cares about that. They notice that. They hear about that from business leaders and from constituents if things are not going the way that they want in the insurance market. So, we are constantly in contact with folks on the Hill and with federal agencies, just educating them on what we're doing, again, trying to make sure they understand that we've got this. The states have a fairly evolved and robust system there to regulate the market, maintain stable markets and protect consumers. And then also, to the extent they're building public policy that could impact insurance companies or policyholders or insurance regulation, we want to make sure they understand the implications of doing that. State regulation of insurance is not a birthright. It is a delegation of power from Congress. And we are very mindful of the the fact that they can take it away. So, I've got 6 or 7 people in my office who do little else other than engaging with members of Congress, weighing in on public policy, evaluating, a federal agency pronouncements, because insurance, again, touches just about every part of the economy in some way, shape, or form. So, and the other thing I would say is we leverage our members. Our members spend more time than people realize educating their delegations, not just at our annual fly-in, but throughout the year. The one cool thing I'll say is that because we work for regulators, we get in some pretty interesting rooms. We get in some conversations that a lot of other people don't get to be in because we have a perspective and I think a credibility on issues that is unique. And so that's been really helpful to us. Obviously they're regulators. We don't have a PAC. We're not writing campaign checks. That's not what gets us into a conversation. It has to be our perspective and our credibility. And so, I'm always very protective of that credibility.
And here we are in the heart of election season, and it's sort of an off-year election. It will, sort of continue undoubtedly beyond this November into the following year when federal elections are held, at least for Congress. And given all that, I just wondered, and Katie, maybe I'll start with you here on this, but what does the election mean to you and how do you do it? Given all of this that we're talking about here, this sort of how does that work, for what the Academy volunteers do in this area?
Yeah, I think when the political landscape shifts, we just have new people to reach out to. There may be some new initiatives that we want to provide updated or new information for. Our committees may take a look at stuff that they've done or get the new information, but the work doesn't change, right? The actuarial science doesn't change. And so we keep moving forward. We keep doing the outreach. We continue to maintain our objectivity. And like Ethan said, we look to shore up our credibility and always protect that despite who got elected this time around.
Similarly, Ethan, is it sort of a little bit of the same? Obviously, election, new people come in, new opportunity, I guess, to sort of talk about what NAIC does and go through the issues. I'm just curious on that.
Well, and I would say it's at 2 levels, right? Because we have some pretty significant state level elections that can impact even who our members are. And the politics, again, come with those new arrivals. We've had a fair number of commissioners turn over in the last year or so. There used to be some old statistics that commissioners are only around for, 18 months or 2 years. It's actually longer than that on average. It's actually a few years. But still, we've had a fair amount of turnover. So just internally, that means we've got new people who bringing, new ideas, which can be good, right? It can also be disruptive if you're kind of going down one path and then someone comes in and you've got to spend a lot of time educating them that they're kind of hopping onto a moving train, even though sometimes they might want to take the train in a different direction. So you got to work through all of that with a new membership. That's very real, and that tends to happen around the election times as well, because ultimately they do work for governors or they're elected. At the federal level, the biggest difference is just the agenda. 1 minute, one party in power, you're working on certain issues, and then all of a sudden those issues are sort of persona non grata. They just go away sometimes overnight. But there are some things that sort of transcend politics. Like every politician cares about what's going on in their district with things like homeowners insurance and auto insurance. Like, can my constituents, what are they paying? Why are their rates going up 30%? So a lot of what we're doing now is just educating. It's not necessarily like commenting on bills, although we do that. It's educating people on what's going on, what's driving the costs in the market on the P&C side or on the life side. We're reading about private equity and alternative assets flowing into the life insurance sector. Are my constituents still safe and sound and protected? And what happens if there's a pension risk transfer to a life insurance company? Are they secure, and what guarantees are there and protections? So we spend a lot of time educating, and that stuff is not really very partisan. That's just explaining that regulation is there to make the market stable, to protect consumers. That's not going to change. We're open for business. We don't get the luxury of shutting down. So we're still on the job doing what we're supposed to do for your constituents. Everybody wants to hear that. So again, we get into some pretty interesting conversations with members of Congress on that.
Well, absolutely. And you're talking about a lot of different interplay here. And Katie, I was just going to turn to you right now and sort of wondering maybe what are some current examples of some of the projects that the Academy and its volunteers are working with the NAIC.
Yeah, I'm glad Ethan sort of broke the barrier on using the technical terms and the need to educate, because like the first few examples come from our Life Practice Council volunteers. They have submitted comments on life and annuity illustrations, on amendments to actuarial guidelines. They've submitted comments on an actuarial guideline template exposure. So those are all going to the Life Actuarial Task Force. And then they've also presented to E-Committee RBC working groups. So the Life RBC and the RBC IRE group talking about CLO, C1 factor modeling, and C3 alignment. So as you can tell just from that list of things, there's a lot of education that needs to go into what we're talking about, what we're providing. If a new regulator, if a person doesn't understand RBC or factors or modeling or actuarial guidelines. And so that's part of what we do too, in addition to providing the presentations and the comment letters. Our Casualty Practice Council has been busy. The Homeowners Insurance Task Force and P&C RBC Committee provided both C and E subgroups, comments, presentations. They've worked with them. I think I mentioned that before, the Health Practice Council's work with Senior Issues Task Force. We've engaged with and reached out to regulatory framework, to B committee, and then we've been doing work on international committee, AI and big data. We're just sort of engaging everywhere. And we take a look at exposures that come out of the committees and we see, do we have an actuarial perspective to add? And if we don't, we may not comment. But if there is an actuarial perspective, even if it's, we agree with the approach you've taken, we want to make sure that we share that as well. So if people go to the website and look under the practice councils, they'll see the lists of the comments and the presentations to the NAIC, and there's just an overwhelming number of them.
We love comments where someone just says, we agree. That's the best kind of comment letter to get. So thank you for that, Katie.
They're so fun to write too.
Well, then building on all of this, where does the Academy and the NAIC go from here? Any future projects to discuss? I'll start again with Katie on this, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think the committees and the subcommittees across our practice councils will continue to push out resources, will continue to respond to requests for assistance, to exposures, and then, our volunteers are just tireless. In addition to their full-time day job or while they're living their best life in retirement, and they're working on stuff for the Academy as volunteers. So we have new and updated toolkits, we have new and updated resource pages, new and updated issue briefs, just across the spectrum. I think the bottom line is actuaries, do a lot of work, and most people think when they hear actuary, if they know what an actuary is, the first thing they think about is insurance. And insurance is a kitchen table issue. So I think we're really excited to continue to build out the resource library, share the resources, and continue to support state regulators and NAIC staff and the work that they do for their constituents.
Yeah, I think maybe looking forward, right, we've got a pretty big initiative underway on modernizing RBC. RBC's been around since the 90s. I think it's held up very well. And of course, it's not static. It's every year, tweaks happen to it. But this is, I think, the first time in a while that there's been a very holistic review of RBC, making sure that it's continuing to do what we think it should be doing and continues to be a relevant tool for regulators. So that's a big one where I think the Academy could be helpful. Again, I think I've mentioned it, but a lot of attention on alternative investments in structured finance and sort of the growing role that that's playing in insurance. I think the Academy could be helpful there in kind of analyzing and helping us with certain aspects of that work. We're seeing a lot of, life insurance reserves now going offshore. So, cash flow testing and reserve adequacy testing is a big part of what we'll be doing over the next, couple of years here. The rise of AI and how insurance companies are using that in virtually every aspect of their business now. And, obviously there's some pretty strong consumer protection laws and, transparency laws and, fair practice laws in the States. And we've put out some principles and a bulletin on kind of how those things apply to the use, for example, of artificial intelligence or large language models. But, I think the regulators are actively evaluating, is that sufficient to the task at hand, given how embedded and pervasive now the use of AI is in a number of functions that are kind of directly impacting consumer-facing decisions and their experience. So that will be a big one. And we will take any help we can get on that because none of us are PhDs in AI technology at the NAIC. So that, I think things like modernizing privacy protections will be another one, the stability of homeowners insurance markets, analyzing the data that we're getting to understand the trends in that space will be very, very helpful. So there's plenty of work to do, no shortage of job security for your members and volunteers or for mine. I think one of the hard things, candidly, is just cutting through the noise. I mean, I know the Academy has all these great resources and insights, and it's just tough to have everything kind of get cut through the noise of all of the different work that regulators are doing with the limited attention span that they have. They have to spread themselves across a range of issues. So putting some energy into what is the best way to reaching regulators and getting their attention, not just limiting yourself to showing up and commenting at the microphone for 3 minutes at a national meeting. Being creative in how you reach regulators, I think, will also be an area that the Academy will need to explore in the months ahead.
I appreciate all that. Before we go, though, I wanted to give both of you an opportunity to sum up any loose ends, or as far as the great work that both these organizations do and work together. And Katie, I'll turn to you to start.
Ethan definitely mentioned several things that are not just on our radar, but in active work with our committees, particularly the RBC model governance work. And so maybe we'd come back for an RBC update down the road as a podcast. I think it would be good because things are definitely moving very fast and at a frantic pace on the RBC stuff. So it will be good when we get to a lull, like that ever happens, but maybe just report back on what's going on there. But I agree. I think we're working on making our resources available to more audiences beyond the actuaries. So, you can expect to see more from us as we build out our engagement with the NAIC, but also with policy makers, with market regulation teams, with form review staff, and then even outside the NAIC with more stakeholders and policy legislative areas, you name it, but also being very thoughtful and intentional about the way we do that outreach and the way we do that engagement, because we want to make the resources meaningful and helpful and not be part of the noise for our busy stakeholders.
And what about you, Ethan?
Maybe I would end where I started and just thank the Academy for, decades now of contributions to public policy that I think when you look through and see, you can see the imprint in every state in the country. That's work that I feel proud of here at the NAIC. I hope Academy members and staff feel proud of the role that they have played. And frankly, without the Academy, I don't think I would have gotten exposure to this world and the NAIC and, all of these fun and exciting issues. So a thanks to the Academy for giving me that entree. But now we've got a lot to do, lots of work, lots of unique challenges. The markets are evolving, products are changing, consumer expectations are changing. And so we just view the Academy as a critical partner and, responding to that. So thank you.
Thank you both for today and all your insights that you gave. Listeners can learn more about the Academy's work with the NAIC by heading over to the Academy's Actuarially Sound blog and reading Katie's blog reviewing the Academy's work at the NAIC summer meeting at www.actuary.org, or by viewing the Academy's webinar recapping the conference at the Academy's YouTube page. My name is Ted Gotch, and I am pleased to have had the opportunity to host this episode of Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Visit our website at www.actuary.org to learn more about all we do here at the Academy. You can also follow us on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast at your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, be well.